silence, Earthling. My name is Darth Vader. I'm an extraterrestrial sent here from the planet Vulcan, and I have a special mission for you. So, what do you think?
Well, if I'm being honest, I don't entirely hate it. It's got levels and you can beat them.
Wait, what? You like this? You do realize this game is awful, right? Like, this is supposed to be one of the worst games of all time.
Well, it's not the worst thing I've ever played. Yeah, it's pretty good, I guess.
What the hell is wrong with you?
Hey everybody! So my basement's been getting renovated lately, and as I'm sure you can already tell, I figured I could travel to a time in the future when my basement's already been finished so that I could keep making videos for you guys as uninterrupted as possible, and yeah, I mean, mission accomplished, I guess. Although, kinda weird, I actually found my chair here of all things, which is okay. Released in September 1989, Back to the Future is an adaptation of the popular science fiction romance comedy of the same name for the NES. In it, Marty McFly is tasked with going back to the future after he's been sent from his time period of 1985 to 1955 and has to ensure that his parents get together or get erased from existence should he fail. Developed by the Australian company Beam Software and published by LJN, the game was put out on the market just 2 months before Back to the Future Part 2 came out in theaters and was followed up with a sequel of its own that covered parts 2 and 3 of the Back to the Future series a year later. Since then, there have been a handful of other Back to the Future games released for home consoles that range from being excellent or passable amusements all the way down to being decidedly not so. Over the years, Back to the Future for the NES has garnered a reputation online for being one of the worst video games of all time, in part due to a review published for the game way back in 2006 by one angorous video gaming nerdophile, James Rolfe. It would go on to be reviewed by other channels of the time too, like the Irate Gamer or Classic Game Room, and in a lot of ways probably helped cement retro video game reviews as being something worth watching on the then still burgeoning YouTube. As for what people thought of the game back in the day, well, there isn't really that much to go off of. While it did appear way back in the 9th issue of Nintendo Power, it didn't really get more than a sentence or two advertising the game. And as for classic reviews of it, the only one that I could find was from the April 1991 issue of what looks to be a Portuguese magazine called Video Game. It doesn't look like there was a live link for that review, even on the Internet Archive though, but according to Moby Games, it actually got a 4 out of 5 from them. At any rate, that review was probably an outlier even then, as Back to the Future's co-creator and self-professed gamer Bob Gale would go on to reveal in a 2010 interview on Telltale's blog that he had actually done interviews telling fans not to buy it, as well as adding in that he was ashamed that it had the Back to the Future brand on it. And just because he could, he even went on to have the AVGN's review of the game hyperlinked in the article too for good measure. Suffice to say, Back to the Future for the NES isn't exactly all that fondly remembered. Instead, and somewhat interestingly, retro game culture's collective hate boner for this game is what's looked back at with a sense of nostalgia, though it's honestly not that hard to see why. After all, as I mentioned earlier, YouTube was still in its early days of cultural relevance back in 2006, and gaming videos in particular were a far cry from the commodity that they are now. When the AVGN's review of Back to the Future came out, it stood out, and along with James's other early videos, helped establish the concept of the angry reviewer, something that would go on to become a staple on the site for years to come before slowly transforming into the current state of review and analysis content on the site. And look, I'm not even gonna pretend that I'm qualified or fully prepared to go full anthropologist mode over the development of YouTube. I'm simply trying to paint a picture depicting how important this game is, as without James's video about it, online video and YouTube as a whole may have turned out very differently from the site we know and love today. In a weird way, ragging on Back to the Future for the NES and the majority of LJN's output in general almost feels like an affirmation of sorts towards that era of YouTube. Because 16 years later and over 13 million views later, if you count the video where he revisited the game along with the original upload, it's obvious that the vast majority of people who've watched it probably haven't played the game to begin with. Simply put, it's become bigger than just being a fun piece of content about the past. The video has become nostalgic in and of itself, on top of whatever nostalgia may actually be had for the game itself too. Which brings me to why I thought this would be a fun video to make. Because even though I didn't necessarily grow up with this game, I did grow up watching his videos, and I do attribute a lot of them with how I ended up getting into retro gaming and filmmaking as a whole. So yeah, welcome to A Positive Spin, a show dedicated to checking out some of the worst games of all time and trying to make the best of our time with it. I'm your host Niche, and I'm joined today by none other than the great scientist himself, Dr. Emmett Brown. Say what's up, Doc.
Great Scott! They're here! Those science fiction films from the 30s, 40s, and 50s I ordered are finally here, and they look fantastic on my mega screen TV.
Okie dokie then. Anyway, I'll also be exploring the context surrounding this game, our nostalgia for the title and the reviews about the game, as well as nostalgia as a whole on some level, and I'm hoping to actually be able to do this in a fun and somewhat easy to digest fashion. And seeing as it could be argued that we live in a post-modern hellscape governed only by nostalgic creature comforts and our attachments to intellectual property.
Hey, remember Ghostbusters? Oh, I remember.
Remember when this was just a no-frills retro review channel, and I've recently found myself struggling to engage with Back to the Future as a franchise despite my love for it due to personal stuff, which I'll touch on later. I thought now would be as good a time as any to cover its original video game. Because Back to the Future is really interesting in the sense that the context to which you view it can radically change how you view your experience with it. And while that's true of most games, as well as art, media, and life in general, something about Back to the Future stands out in how that's the case for it due to its source material ostensibly being about revising history and being outwardly nostalgic about a bygone era to begin with. Before we continue though, a quick question of the day. What's a popular franchise, brand, or media thingy that you'd love to see get turned into a video game? Even if it already has been, you can actually advocate for it again, I promise. What console from any era would you put it on, and why'd you pick what you did? Be sure to leave your answer to the question of the day over in the comments. I'd love to hear your answer. And if you're new here and are enjoying what you see so far, feel free to subscribe to the channel and stuff so that you can check out all the other videos I'll be putting out in the future. On top of that, feel free to support my channel via donation or subscription on Buy Me a Coffee or Patreon if you want to access a few bonus goodies and to help me make more videos. And with that out of the way, on with the video. Right off the bat, Back to the Future's attempt to adapt the story of its namesake is tangential at best. As Marty McFly, you're tasked with making your way through several approximations of scenes from the movie by navigating through a top-down view of Hill Valley and participating in several minigames. And right off the bat, we're quickly introduced to one of the game's most notorious problems, which is that it has seemingly nothing to do with Back to the Future. Like, okay, it technically adapts Marty's adventure in 1955 in a way that works within the context of a video game, but it also technically doesn't do a particularly good job of it. To the point of the manual literally going out of its way to remind you that it's based on the movie. While traversing through the game's predominant stage type, the street scenes as the manual likes to call it, you'll find yourself automatically walking forward as you try to avoid hula hooping girls on the street, get actively chased by thugs, and dodging guys trying to cross the street while holding a sheet of glass. You know, 50 stuff. Oh, and there are also bees that can start to swarm you and will follow you through hell and high water too, unless you can kill them. As for how you can do that, the game is fairly accommodating by giving you item pickups to fight enemies in the form of a bowling ball. You know, 50 stuff. In all seriousness, the bowling ball as a pickup idea honestly isn't that bad though. It may not have anything to do with the movies directly, but at the very least, they at least went with something that was popular back in the 1950s and makes a little sense in that context. That said, the extremely random image of Marty McFly sprinting down the street, leaping over trash cans, and chucking a 10 to 12 pound bowling ball at bees, honest working types and children, is also pretty bleak. But even though I know one of the chief complaints held against this game is the sheer absurdity and the dilution of its source material from film to cartridge, I can't help but find it kinda charming. I'll get into this a bit more later, but something about the simplification of Back to the Future's already simplified take on the 1950s to work on the NES is just a lot of fun. And call me nuts, but the gameplay ain't half bad either. Aside from the bowling ball, these street scenes also feature another item in the form of a skateboard, which Marty can hop onto in order to zoom through town like he did in the movie. From there, these stages more or less just become a race against the clock, as they need to be completed before a timer on the bottom right of the screen runs out, or before the people in the picture that's also located on the bottom of the screen fully fades from existence. More or less just like in the movie. Although it isn't exactly like it was there though, as it looks like 2 of the 3 people in the photograph are the 1985 and 1955 versions of Doc Brown respectively. Which is especially hilarious seeing as it's seemingly impossible to kill Doc Brown to begin with.
That's the way to fly!
Anyway, the characters in that photo slowly fade away if left uncared for, but can be regenerated and saved by picking up the clocks thrown about in the street. Essentially, to get through these stages in one piece, you'll need to dodge enemies or mow them down Pinhead style, buy yourself some time picking up clocks, because, you know, subtlety's dead and all, and get to the end of the stage, which is always shown to be an intersection before time runs out, though this usage of time is separate from the aforementioned ones you can get back by picking up clocks.
You know, on second thought, they may have just given you a bowling ball because Marty's band in the 80s was called the Pinheads. On the other hand, it could just be an amazing coincidence.
When I sat down to play this game, I was actually pretty surprised by how much fun I found myself having in these stages. I guess it's just that after years of listening to people go on and on about how bad they were, as well as the faint memories I have of experiencing these stages myself some 15 or so years ago, I kinda just expected them to be worse? And like, I won't go as far as to say that these stages are great or anything, but I don't know, they honestly don't strike me as being that offensive. I mean, yeah, there's definitely stuff here that's a little weird, like the manual calling those thugs on the street that chase you around Biff's friends, but I still honestly found these segments pretty fun. One of the things I was really surprised by in this game was the fact that it at least required a bit of strategy to get through it. For starters, even though collecting clocks helps keep you from getting erased from existence, your photo doesn't reset between normal stages until you've completed one of the game's other stage types, which are ostensibly boss battles. And this means that you'll need to make sure to always collect as many of them as you can, and on top of that, because you have a normal time limit in each of these stages, it also means that you'll need to make sure that you don't run out of time in the stages themselves, which will probably push you to try and kill enemies or pick up a skateboard to get through the level faster. This all culminates in gameplay that feels hectic at times in a pretty good way. And as if that weren't enough, aiming to hit enemies can sometimes feel a bit unintuitive since your bowling balls aren't actually fired from the center of your sprite, but are rather thrown slightly from the right of your center. It sounds like a small bit of detail for the game to throw in, mainly because it is, but something about it felt off to me in execution after spending years playing stuff like Galaga, which trained my brain to aim from the center of my sprite and not the side of it. Now, I won't pretend this makes the game deep or anything, but it's still a nice bit of detail that makes it a bit more interesting. It's also worth mentioning that the game features a bit of RNG in things like item placement, which can also add more depth to the gameplay. For example, even though the skateboard can greatly speed up your traversal through Hill Valley, you may not want to use it if it spawns too close to a wall or obstacle, since crashing into something forces you to waste a couple of seconds trying to get back off the floor. Oh yeah, and that's what this is according to the manual, by the way. I think it's supposed to be a reference to when Marty falls off his skateboard halfway through the movie, but it honestly ends up looking a bit more like a temper tantrum than anything else. While I'm talking about that though, I feel like one of the things that would have made this game a bit more fun would have been giving Marty a small variety of damage animations to cycle through. As is, the only thing that really happens in the game when you take a hit is that you trip and fall over. And while that's perfectly fine and functional for at least a couple of the situations here, it does kinda get old to look at after a while.
And like, I'm not asking the devs to have come up with all these gruesome animations like something out of Mortal Kombat or anything either. I just think it would have made for an interesting bit of visual flair to see Marty actually react to his environments, sorta like the guy did in Dragon's Lair whenever you died. Honestly, anything could have worked here so long as it mixed up the visuals on screen a bit.
Other than that though, there isn't really that much else to these stages, aside from the fact that Marty isn't wearing his iconic red vest from the movie in them. But realistically, that probably had more to do with the NES's color palette limitations and black being a color that's already used in each of the game's levels to begin with, so I don't know, it's not the end of the world. Either way though, it's not that hard to wish that the guys over at Beam Software had found a way to give Marty his brown hair and a red vest though. But on the other hand, it does allow me to pretend that this version of Marty McFly is actually Eric Stoltz's version of the character from before he was recast with Michael J. Fox. Because like, why not? He's got darker hair than Michael J. Fox, and all the existing stills of him in the movie do show him in a black jacket.
Did you like that idea? I got it out of this coping mechanism I built in the future out of my dead dreams and a pile of old unrecycled batteries. It also has Boss Skaggs' greatest hits on it.
But aside from the street scenes, there's also a few other gameplay styles that each get a stage to shine in. And to make things even better, they even kind of attempt to adapt scenes from the movie. Now, I do say kinda because while they are scenes from the movie in the sense that you can trace their roots to moments in Back to the Future, they're also fairly far removed from how things went in the movie due to the film itself not really being all too video game friendly. All in all, there are 4 of these stages spread throughout your adventure, and they take place at Lou's Cafe, Hill Valley High School, the Fish Under the Sea Dance.
No, it was the Enchantment Under the Sea Dance.
The Enchantment Under the Sea Dance in downtown Hill Valley during the movie's climactic lightning storm. Each of these minigames take on a new gameplay style that are extremely simple in their premise and execution. Lou's Cafe has you throwing milkshakes at a horde of either hungry customers or Biff's friends. The high school stage has you using a book to catch hearts thrown at you by Lorraine. The Enchantment Under the Sea Dance is a music minigame, and the final level is a driving stage where you need to accelerate up to 88 miles per hour while dodging lightning. Besides the fact that each of these stages obviously make little to no sense within the context of the movie, for example, why is Marty catching Lorraine's hearts with a book unless it's very explicitly a book about how scientifically wrong this situation is, they each serve the purpose of keeping the walking stages from getting too stale and are mostly fine for what they are because of it. One of the most common complaints I've heard about the first 2 of these stages is that they're way too hard for their own good, and while I certainly see what people mean when they say it on account of how sensitive Marty controls in it, tapping the D-pad to minimize Marty's movements goes a long way in making them easier to get through. Though aiming can admittedly be a bit frustrating too, as the angle you're looking in on the action from doesn't really lend itself towards giving you a fair understanding of where your projectiles or Lorraine's Jocastian affections for her son are headed. The color of the hearts in her stage also really don't help either, as it blends in with the floorboards of the level a bit too well to be easy to process while in the heat of the action. But don't take my word for it. Hey Doc, what did you think of this level?
Dr. Emmett Brown once again, and boy am I steamed! I'm really about to blow my top!
Hey Doc, have you been drinking?
As for the other 2 stages, well, they aren't that bad. Once you realize that the music stage is about hitting the musical notes with your guitar and that the game telegraphs where they'll go based off of whether or not the note is a sharp, eighth, or flat note, it's honestly pretty hard to fail at. It is worth mentioning that missing notes takes a ton of your progress away and that the minigame genuinely becomes harder to win at the longer you let it run for though. And the last minigame's fine, I guess. I wouldn't call it particularly hard either, since all you have to do is hold up on the D-pad, dodge lightning, and make sure you're going 88 miles per hour by the time you reach the end of the stage. But messing up at it does result in an automatic game over, which is extremely cruel given the fact that failing at any of the other stages just sends you back to the last walk-in stage you had done before you can try it again. In spite of their issues though, I can't really say that I hated any of these stage types. If anything, they actually remind me of the sort of games you may have played on something like the Atari 2600 or some Game & Watch titles.
The Lou's Cafe stage plays a bit like Space Invaders, only horizontally. The high school level is more or less just a horizontal version of Kaboom, the music minigame is just Manhole if you think about it, and both the street scenes and the DeLorean level aren't that far removed from the general gameplay loops you'd expect from games from that era. The walking stages also specifically remind me of Paperboy, albeit from a slightly easier to understand angle.
And even though that kinda makes the game sound really simple for something that came out at the height of the NES's prowess, I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing.
If anything, you could kind of argue that it's quaint for this game to be a bit of a throwback to gaming's roots. After all, Atari's prime was give or take 10 years behind them by the time this game made it out to stores, and as such was far enough back that people may have started to get a little nostalgic about it. And seeing as Back to the Future itself was an exercise in 50s nostalgia, something that it isn't exclusive in being, by the way. 50s nostalgia was sort of a thing in the 80s and had actually gotten its start back in the 70s with stuff like Happy Days and Grease. It kinda makes sense for the Back to the Future game itself to be a little nostalgic. The obvious problem there, though, is that while there were technically video games back in the 50s, emulating them over something from the 70s or early 80s would have meant putting out a product that looked more like Tennis for Two.
And I'm not even saying that that was the intent of the developers or anything, because let's be honest, they probably just got a memo one day at their office saying, make a game about Back to the Future before the second movie hits the cinemas. And then they did that. I'm simply saying that Back to the Future for the NES isn't actually that bad of a game, so much as it's a game that's really disappointing because it came out after gamers had started to expect more from the medium. And while it's not that terrible, its biggest flaw is that it doesn't have that much in common with the movie that it's supposed to be an adaptation of. Though I do have some thoughts about that I'll be getting into in just a little bit.
But let's be honest, a lot of the reputation that Back to the Future for the NES has garnered over the years has been for fairly good reason. Simply put, while the game itself isn't that bad, it is disappointing. And regardless of whether or not the developers did the best they could to make a video game adaptation of a movie that really couldn't have organically been translated to 8-bit hardware to begin with, the simple fact of the matter is that the concept itself was flawed from the get-go. I doubt this will come as a shock to anybody, but the NES and video games as a whole just wasn't ready for a good Back to the Future game yet.
I guess you guys aren't ready for that yet. But you kids are gonna love it.
Even several years later with the likes of Super Back to the Future 2 for the Super Famicom, it still didn't feel like anybody had quite yet cracked the code on how to adapt the franchise into being a fun and well-made video game.
Though to be fair, Super Back to the Future 2 did get close. It just ended up missing the mark due to some iffy level design and a lot of slowdown during gameplay. If you want to hear my thoughts about that game, I actually did a review of it back when I started this channel like a year and a half ago, though I do have to warn you guys that it's nothing like the videos I make these days and I don't really like it that much. If anything, I'd actually just really like to redo that video sometime in the future if you guys want to see that.
Anyway, looking past Back to the Future's gameplay, there isn't really much else to cover. The game's graphics are, well, they are what they are, and things actually run pretty smoothly. I wouldn't call any of the game's color choices or sprite designs inspired, but things mostly resemble what they're supposed to, aside from Marty of course, and as for the music... well yeah, that's pretty bad. I mean, there's a reason why I've avoided playing any of it in the video so far, you know? The game has this mind-numbingly repetitive tune that's played during all of the walking stages and during the final driving one that's supposed to be a cover of Power of Love from the movie's soundtrack, but is being played way too fast to be recognizable. Though I don't know whether that's done to avoid copyright issues or due to a bug of some kind. At any rate, it gets old really fast. The game also features one other song during the Enchantment Under the Sea dance that's supposed to be Johnny Be Good, but also feels a bit too sped up for its own good. And that's it. The Lou's Cafe and high school stages both skip out on music altogether and are honestly all the better for it. The lack of music really amps up the Atari-ness of these levels and genuinely makes me wish the entire game didn't feature music to begin with, which I realize is kinda weird to suggest given how good the movie's score and soundtrack are. Overall, I wouldn't say that Back to the Future is all too bad of a game. If anything, it's more disappointing than it is outright bad, but it's still worth some fun if you tend to enjoy simpler, more pick up and play games. While it may not be worth a night of dedicated entertainment, the years have been relatively kind to it in the sense that it's far from being too offensive in its gameplay, and it's a cheap enough and common game to find in the wild. It definitely helps to go into a playthrough of it with low expectations though, and if you're the kind of person that likes to mindlessly play something while you passively listen to a podcast or YouTube video, I don't know, it might be worth your time. One of the things I thought while I was capturing footage for this video was that it may have actually felt more at home on the Game Boy than it did on the NES. Given the game's short length of only being about 30 minutes long or so, its simpler gameplay, and the fact that its color palette had little to do with the movie, it just may have fared a bit better on Nintendo's gray brick. At the very least, I feel like it would have had a better chance of sidestepping some of the critiques the game got on Nintendo's home hardware and made for a fine amusement. I could be a bit biased though, since I played this game on a handheld emulator and basically experienced it in the way that a Game Boy owner would have had they gone this route though.
And on that note, I think it's time that we took a step away from the review part of this video and decided to look at the context surrounding this game and its legacy since its release. Alright, so let's take a look at the context surrounding the game now, as I genuinely think it's fairly interesting and also serves to explain why this game is the way that it is. However, seeing as I've already touched on the idea that this game is a reflection of old video games done for the NES generation, I'm gonna hold off on going into further detail about that until a bit later in the video.
It may be kinda hard for some of you guys to remember this depending on how old you are, but there was once a time when, prior to the introduction of smartphones and cross-brand integration in the likes of Fortnite and other games, movies and TV shows often found themselves getting licensed into video games. And while the quality of the vast majority of these titles often skewed towards schlocky or mediocre, that was just kinda to be expected on some level. Like, at the risk of sounding like a true and utter cynic, these games usually felt like they had been willed into existence by a room of marketers who were more interested in exploiting whatever IP they were associated with and didn't really care whether or not the game was any fun. Which is probably why we ended up with a game like Back to the Future, right?
Oh, don't mind the noise! It's just my coping mechanism writing the rest of this video! And we're done!
You see, Back to the Future NES is what I like to call peak LJN, and not in the
son of a bitch
way, but rather in the sense that it was just a piece of licensed merchandise. I won't really get too into detail about this since the gaming historians already covered this topic at length a few years ago, but LJN's roots are actually in toys and merchandising. And much as was often the case back in the 80s and 90s, licensed merchandise didn't always need to have much in common with their source material, especially if that source material wasn't explicitly for kids to begin with. For example, when I was a kid, I distinctly remember owning some RoboCop action figures that I can only imagine had been in the clearance section of KB Toys or were related to the short-lived animated series from 1998. And I genuinely think that those toys and the cartoon that was associated with it is a pretty great encapsulation of what I'm getting at. Because yeah, RoboCop isn't for kids. The first movie was a biting satire of capitalism run amok and the over-militarization and privatization of our police force that used excessive violence and sexual references to tell a story that in itself was a retelling of the prosecution and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And while its sequels would lighten the tone up a lot and the cartoon was definitely intended for a younger audience, it's hard to look at what happened to the franchise and go, huh, yeah, these artistic decisions definitely weren't monetarily motivated. RoboCop fighting a cyborg ninja that you could pick up a doll of at your local Toys R Us was totally inspired by something other than wanting to put a second pool in on top of your first one. Similarly, the Terminator franchise went through the same exact thing. The first movie was also a Christ metaphor sci-fi flick that spawned one of my favorite movies of all time for its sequel, got a bunch of merch aimed squarely at kids despite featuring the depiction of a literal nuclear holocaust in it, and eventually became a parody of itself for most of its third movie.
It's almost as if there's something innately monetizable about stories of salvation. But on the other hand, it could just be another amazing coincidence.
And that pattern of merchandise being merchandise for merchandise sake goes far beyond those extreme examples, as properties like Ghostbusters, TMNT, and even freaking Rambo all started off as adult-focused entertainment that spun off into cartoons and toys for kids, and in the case of some of them, their premises would even find themselves stretched as far as they needed to be in order to fit their newfound formats. Hell, look at the animated Karate Kid series from back in the day. It's literally just a generic cartoon about traveling the planet in search of magical artifacts and fighting evil, dressed up as a sequel to a coming-of-age sports movie. And look, I'm not even saying that these spin-offs are a bad thing. I grew up loving Ninja Turtles, and I also know how much people like the animated Ghostbusters show from back in the day too. Plus, I even enjoyed what I saw of the Rambo cartoon for the sheer absurdity of its premise and attempt to cash in on the success of G.I. Joe. And I also unironically think that the Karate Kid cartoon has a really catchy theme song.
What's the name of that show?
Say, what are we watching anyway?
Is it Back to the Future?
It's Back to the Future.
I'm just trying to establish that there's a precedent for merchandise being inaccurate to its source material and that this was extremely common back in the 80s. And with that in mind, I don't think it's really that surprising that Back to the Future's NES game is as far removed from the movie as it is. After all, if Commando can get a full toy line that literally only features 2 characters from the movie itself, what's so different about the Back to the Future game playing it fast and loose in its depiction of potential incest? Ultimately, the game falls firmly into the camp of being merchandise as opposed to its own thing, and given the fact that video games were still primarily viewed as toys, in no small part due to Nintendo's marketing for the NES explicitly going out of its way to make sure people viewed it that way, it isn't that crazy to go into this with low expectations.
Because again, it's a licensed game. It literally is a piece of merchandise.
Frankly, given the fact that we don't really get many dedicated licensed games these days, it's also just kinda cool to look back at this time in gaming and compare it to what we have now. Because like, even though being able to play as Spider-Man or any number of popular characters in something like Fortnite is cool and a generally better experience than what you'd get from any licensed video game, there's also something kinda special about seeing something you love get its own dedicated cartridge.
And I'm not trying to claim that this game being merch is an excuse for it being bad, because like, it's totally fair if people were really disappointed with this game back in the day. I totally get why they would have been, but rather that it's just a vital piece of context towards understanding it. Albeit one that potentially runs the risk of romanticizing rampant capitalism and the need to exploit IP for profit. Speaking of which, that brings us to the idea of nostalgia and the part of the video where I sound even less in touch with reality than I usually do.
According to a 2014 Psychology Today article, nostalgia is a portmanteau of the Greek words nostos, which means homecoming, and algos, which means pain. It's a word
Go on.
that was originally invented in 1688 by a Swiss medical student named Johannes Hofer, who used it to describe the feeling of homesickness felt by mercenaries fighting in other countries. Over the years, nostalgia would even go on to be described as a mental disorder and disease in need of treatment, to the point of the 18th century French doctor and certified f***ed-up sicko of this episode, Dr. Jordan Lecointe, even going as far as to try and quell people's melancholic rumination through what he described as, quote, inflicting pain and terror in his patients. And in another case from the same century, a Russian general went as far as to straight up bury the first of his troops to exhibit signs of nostalgia out of a fear that it would spread amongst his men like a virus. However, and I'm sure much to Lecointe and that general's disappointment, that isn't really the case anymore. If anything, nostalgia is actively encouraged in society these days as we're constantly bombarded with throwback Thursdays, reboots or remakes, and content about things from the past like this video itself. As opposed to just being used to describe soldiers feeling homesick, it's taken on a newer meaning of longing for the past, even if it's one that we weren't even around for, and often involves romanticizing that past.
It's interesting about the word nostalgia, isn't it? Because we somehow cannot live in the present.
And for the record, that doesn't mean I think that nostalgia's bad or that we shouldn't enjoy things from yesteryear. Because like, that'd be super hypocritical of me to do so. I literally have a retro game review channel and a retro movie and TV podcast, and I'm literally just like the guy from Family Ties. I don't know why I did the Fonzie thing right now. That's on me.
It's just that nostalgia's become an extremely pervasive part of society, and like we're stuck in this weird mode of consumption when it comes to nostalgic content. In a few ways, it feels like our fixation with nostalgia has come to define our entire personality as opposed to just being one part of it. There's a passage in that Psychology Today article that I think really nails what I'm getting at and reads, "If overindulged, nostalgia can give rise to a utopia that never existed and never can exist, but is pursued at all costs, sapping all life and joy and potential from the present. For many people, paradise is not so much a place to go to as the place they think they came from." Essentially, it's the idea that nostalgia can be rooted in falsehoods, that it can represent a prettified version of a past era, and that a fixation on that falsehood can prevent us from fully realizing the good in the present.
Well, here's an active memorial. Nostalgia. That's why you're here. You're a tourist in your own youth.
What other moments will you be revisiting? Here's a good one. How about the time you sold Tommy his very first hit, leading him on to heroin addiction, HIV infection, and ultimately his death at the age of, what was it, 22, 23?
23.
23.
Even the movie Back to the Future itself was well aware of this on a subtextual level, or at least as aware of it as a relatively lighthearted movie about a mom wanting to bang her teenage son could be. The movie paints the then present-day Hill Valley as being a bit of a rundown place to live. It's not a bad place to live by any stretch of the word, but it's one that's fairly rooted in reality. The high school looks old and maybe a little unkept, there are homeless people on the street, and there's a clock in the town square that hasn't worked for 30 years. You could even argue that the town being more interested in preserving the clock tower in a state of disrepair as opposed to actually fixing it reflects the stasis that the town is in.
Save the clock tower! Save the clock tower!
But the literal second Marty steps back in time, the town is suddenly an idyllic dreamland of sorts, even going as far as to have the Four Aces version of Mr. Sandman score Marty's walk around through the town square. Instead of homeless people, we suddenly have police officers strolling down the sidewalk. The high school looks brand spanking new, and even the town's historic clock tower still works. The only problem, though, is that this isn't the actual 1950s. There are no references to McCarthyism, segregation and racism is literally explored to the extent of,
"I could run for mayor!" A colored mayor, that'll be the day.
And Marty accidentally writing Johnny Be Good, which implies that this universe's Chuck Berry is a plagiarist, and the anxiety surrounding nuclear winter being relegated to a simple, "Don't stop till we're done!" And
Radiations. Of course. Because of all the fallout from the atomic wars.
Which is fine and all, seeing as this movie is trying to be a romantic science fiction comedy about a kid playing matchmaker to his parents and wasn't trying to be anything more than that, but it's also a great encapsulation of nostalgia. Even the movie's idea of Marty inadvertently improving his present by going back to the past and playing matchmaker for his dad that sucks ass at socializing falls relatively in line with that Psychology Today quote I shared earlier, in the sense that it represents the somewhat paradoxical idea that revisiting and ruminating over yesterday can somehow improve the present. And yes, while failing to study history can mean we're doomed to repeat it, ruminating on a distorted version of the past can be as destructive as trying to predict the future. Taking things back to the NES game, the same logic can also be applied there. Like I mentioned earlier, it's entirely possible to look at this game as being a nostalgic reflection of Atari and early arcade-era gameplay brought over to Nintendo's home console. Additionally, you could also argue that the very existence of the game itself is to bank on people's then likely to still be percolating nostalgia for the original movie, especially since its gameplay is actually more similar to something from 1985 than it is a title from its actual release year. After all, a more modern interpretation for nostalgia is a fondness for something or a time we remember enjoying, so making a video game for a movie from 4 years earlier to help cash in on its upcoming sequel falls relatively in line with it. And as if that weren't enough, you could also look at this game's take on the 1950s as also being a product of nostalgia, given the fact that it was developed by an Australian company that likely had little to no connection to the actual American 1950s and probably just cribbed some of the era's visual motifs from Back to the Future, Happy Days, and any other pop culture hallmark that took place during the decade. It's a good thing that they didn't look to Mr. Ed for inspiration though, because the idea of Marty talking to a horse may have just been my breaking point. But in doing so, you may end up accidentally putting the game up on a pedestal by using nostalgia to dismiss problems with it that were almost certainly disappointing for players in the year it came out in. Because no matter whether or not you take into consideration this game's status as a piece of merchandise or happen to think that it was pretty fun for what it was like I do, there's also no denying that paying anything more than absolutely bargain bin prices for this game would have been frustrating. Essentially, using nostalgia as an argument to dismiss something can be a bit like playing with fire. It's reasonable to use nostalgia to explain why the product exists and to cut it some slack since it's just a piece of merch for kids based on a popular movie, but it's also just as valid to find yourself, the consumer, equally as irate a gamer over its perceived lack of quality too. After all, new video games weren't cheap back then, nor are they now, and as many of our inner children would attest to, the wait between buying and renting new games could sometimes feel like a lifetime, so every game in your collection had to feel like they were good enough to be played ad infinitum. And even though it's definitely interesting to view this game as being nostalgic for the Stone Age of gaming, that angle honestly falls a bit flat when presented with the fact that the console's main audience, and by proxy the game itself, were kids.
You know, because kids aren't exactly known for looking at and analyzing things beyond the scope of whether or not it was fun or exciting in the moment due to being kids.
Which begs the question, why has this game become so heavily discussed over the years if it doesn't exhibit many traits that the people growing up with it would actually be nostalgic about? And heck, why have so many people who weren't around when the game came out to begin with come to know and recognize it? In a declaration that I'm sure won't surprise most of the people still watching this video, it's at least in part because of the angry video game nerd. When he uploaded his original Back to the Future review to YouTube in 2006, the original movie had just finished celebrating its 20th anniversary, which, alongside the off-cited point online that James's early content and production quality stood out when compared to much of the stuff available on early Web 2.0 era YouTube, is probably why it picked up the kind of traction that it did. And even though the Back to the Future NES game in itself didn't overtly have anything to feel overly nostalgic about for many people, it did still have an association to something that was nostalgic and may have helped it overall. Also, can we just stop pretending that people may not have felt overly nostalgic about this game in and of itself? Like, I know its reputation is far from glowing online, and like I said earlier, I get that it's for fairly good reasons, but that doesn't mean that there aren't people who genuinely enjoyed this game growing up in the same way that I enjoyed the Karate Kid's NES game as a kid. It's often been hypothesized by many a person online, as well as obnoxiously by yours truly back when I used to drink and go to bars, that nostalgia tends to come in roughly 20 to 30 year waves. You can see this in the way that 50s nostalgia cropped up in the 70s and 80s and stuff like American Graffiti and Back to the Future, the way that the 70s was reflected in the 90s thanks to Dazed and Confused and That 70s Show, and how 70s nostalgia eventually gave way to 80s nostalgia by the late 2000s and continues to this day in stuff like Stranger Things and the often soap operatic delight that's Cobra Kai. Anyway, that's all to establish the idea that there's more than meets the eye when it comes to the Back to the Future NES game and nostalgia. Because not only are there people who actually grew up with this game and have an attachment to it, either due to those childhood experiences or their undying love for the movie that spawned it, but there are also people who may find their 2 cups of Nostos and Algos in remembering the early days of YouTube as a platform and when they first watched the Angry Video Game Nerd's review of the game. Due to how different YouTube and the internet as a whole is these days compared to the way things were some almost 20 years ago.
Something that I don't think I'm fully equipped to cope with, by the way.
It's totally reasonable to find yourself remembering a simpler time for the website. Back then, content just felt simpler, both in scope and implication. There was a novelty to being able to hear normal people talking about the things they cared about or watch sketches made by channels like Smosh or Nigahiga using the same basic tools that many of us had in our homes, and as Lady Emily put it in her excellent Cinemassacre Backlash video,
what he brought was a sense of production and presentation and enough professionalism to make it work. In an era where we were just starting to get an internet where anyone could upload videos, the angry video game nerd being something that did things like have quality audio and multiple camera angles and had properly captured game footage and wasn't edited in Windows Movie Maker made it stand out. Yeah, it was never a high budget affair, and James never even tried to hide that this was anything other than him in his room with maybe some friends in Halloween costumes showing up. But the fact that he knew the basics of filmmaking made him really, really above his peers, even once copycats began showing up.
Essentially, James's content stood out from the bunch by distinctly being a cut above the defining characteristics that made early YouTube special, while still distinctly belonging to that movement and being too far removed from what was then more traditional media like television or movies. And his content/particular brand of being an angry reviewer, while not entirely his creation, would prove to become influential and help propagate the modern state of internet video review and gaming culture to some degree, to the point of being able to watch just about any modern game reviewer and see traces of the formula that James helped pioneer in their work in the same way that one could trace influences in movies from one filmmaker to another. Add to that the internet's weird thing for Schadenfreude that was already around in 2006, the fact that the concept of a basement-dwelling gamer getting mad at stuff from his childhood is comedically sound/has some mileage as an idea, and the way that James's expletive-laden comedy synced up with the ferocious vulgarity that internet culture was becoming accustomed to thanks to the anonymity associated with it, and you basically have a recipe for success.
I'm nostalgically pontificating about early YouTube right now, aren't I? I should probably go bury myself. I'll be right back.
You could even argue that some of Cinemassacre's most vocal naysayers' main arguments boiled down to the simple fact that the way James was producing some of his content for a while over the past few years didn't really fulfill their nostalgic leanings towards how they wanted to view him or his content. I'm not really going to touch on that though, since that may just be a bit too far removed from this video's central premise, even for someone as tangential as I am, but it's an argument that at least makes some sense on a cursory level. Though one thing that can easily be extracted from that is the reaffirming of the idea that by desperately hanging on to our relationship with the past and allowing ourselves to become lost in a romanticized version of a YouTube from over 15 years ago, we're holding ourselves back from watching some of the new and exciting content that's on the site now.
Hey y'all, Scott here.
Stuff that may know and understand what we loved about the earlier era of YouTube and put a fun twist on it, be new and unlike anything we may have experienced before, or even be from one of our favorite so-called legacy acts and be a snapshot into how they've grown and matured over the years in the way that human beings do, whether we want them to or not. Using music as an example, it's allowing David Bowie to look past Ziggy Stardust, allowing Prince to look past Purple Rain, and Fleetwood Mac to look past Rumors so that they could grace our ears with incredible music like Low, The Gold Experience, and Tango in the Night. And going back to the Future NES, I guess it's just interesting how much of its current reputation hinges on our collective nostalgia for how funny it was to watch a caricature of a person going through a form of rage-induced arrested development as opposed to our relationship with the product itself or the franchise that spawned it. And it's equally interesting how the very same nostalgia for James's review and its own twist on James's nostalgia for his childhood and the so-called brightening up of his likely pre-adolescent disappointment towards the game via making a comedy video about it was so powerful and resonant with its viewers that it managed to usurp the game's already present nostalgia tethering to Back to the Future. And for the record, that's why I think the AVGN's video and a lot of his channel in general works as well as it does. For me, watching a retro review by James and many other retro gaming channels feels as satisfying as it does because we're able to recognize someone's nostalgia for something in their past and sort of retroactively apply some of it towards our relationship towards that game or a similar one that we've played before. When someone's reviewing a good retro game, I'm able to look at it and think about how impressive the title was for everything it did well and sort of take in a sense of delight over the idea that games back then understood the medium in ways that we don't give it enough credit for. And when someone's reviewing a bad game, I'm able to see that someone's taking a negative experience that they may have had in their childhood and turn it on its head in a way. Even though they aren't directly looking back at it fondly, the fact that it's being used for the entertainment of others on the internet almost makes it nostalgia adjacent, since the emotional endpoint of the video is still one of being amused, and that in itself can generate feelings of nostalgia someday. Stepping back though, it makes me wonder if we're somehow missing out on a part of some of the games we allow nostalgia to overtake our opinions of it on. After sitting down and playing Back to the Future for the NES a dozen or so times between my original slate of recordings of the game, which I lost
lost thanks to a hardware failure, and the other 6 or so times I played it to record for this video, I genuinely found myself enjoying it. It wasn't what I'd call edge-of-your-seat gaming perfection or anything, but it was a decently fun, simpler NES game that caught me off guard by how arrestingly average it was. I mean, I was genuinely shocked by how okay it was, and in realizing that, it made me wonder if I had even disliked the game when I first played it back in middle school, or whether I just sorta drank the figurative Kool-Aid that my young and impressionable mind was served up by some early era YouTube reviews. Had I missed something in the game due to the fact that my expectations had been so lowered by those reviews? Did I bias myself by going into it thinking it was worthless dreck to begin with? And was I somehow preserving the status quo that had been established about this game prior to playing through it for this video in some weird attempt to show respect to my nostalgia for those early reviews? These are all questions that I genuinely asked myself while I was playing through the game. If one of the dangers of overindulging in nostalgia is that it creates a contorted and twisted version of the past with potentially little bearing in reality, and part of the appeal of nostalgic content about stuff that we may not have priorly engaged with is that we can almost symbiotically enjoy someone else's nostalgia on the subject, then we run the risk of addressing the fact that our exposure to that thing is firmly rooted in the present.
Marty, it's perfect. You're just not thinking fourth dimensionally.
Right, I have a real problem with that.
And even though challenging that notion with this game just meant playing a fine, if not somewhat disposable NES game in this case, repeatedly defaulting to other people's nostalgia instead of experiencing things myself could have meant potentially missing out on a genuinely good game someday. Because that statement I said earlier that those who don't study history are doomed to repeat it is true, but it also requires that you, the person studying history, is actually taking the time to critically think about the past as opposed to just passively consuming subjective information about it on the internet. It's not so much that we can't look at, enjoy, and want more of things from the past, but rather that we should try our darndest to allow things from the past to continue to grow as organically as possible out of respect for it, which is kind of what happened with Back to the Future's NES game. For the first 15 or so years after its release, it was simply a bad NES game that was then reevaluated and elevated in the public consciousness thanks to YouTube. But now, almost another 15 or so years later, the question isn't whether or not the game is good or not, it's whether or not it's due for reappraisal again. And I'm not even saying that we should necessarily be singing a different tune about this game nowadays, but rather that we should at least try and say something different about it if we plan to pull it out of the woodwork to begin with. Which is exactly why I ended up reviewing this game to begin with, because I love Back to the Future, have a ton of nostalgia for it, and I wanted to critically analyze it. For those of you that don't know me in real life or haven't watched my channel for long, so, most of you, Back to the Future is one of my favorite movies of all time and something that I used to reference on this channel fairly often. And a huge part of that is due to it being a movie that my best friend Mike and I used to watch and quote constantly before he passed away last year. I mean, to the point of us literally having had an annual Back to the Future night where we'd force many of our friends to sit and watch the entire trilogy with us in a single night and to put up with us quoting the movie. Back to the Future was just sort of our thing. We constantly quoted it on our podcast, we had a matching framed picture of us photoshopped into the third movie, which I'd made as a moving present for him a few years ago, and we just genuinely loved everything about it. In fact, part of the reason why I even played the NES game as a kid to begin with was because after I showed him the AVGN's video about the game and we were getting into retro gaming, he ended up getting a copy for his collection. Which is all to say that, as far as attachments to intellectual property goes for me, Back to the Future is about as sentimental as it gets. Though, after he passed away, it became really hard for me to actually want to sit down and look at anything pertaining to it for a while. I distinctly remember reading the novelization of the first movie last Thanksgiving, just a week or so after his funeral, and feeling a flurry of emotions that was difficult to sit with because even though I really enjoyed the book, it now had some heavily melancholic baggage attached to it. It wasn't so much that the movie no longer appealed to me or anything, of course, but rather that it just felt weirdly inappropriate to engage with it without being able to pick up my phone and text him about it. Additionally, whenever we'd watch the movie, we'd always poke fun at it, and the idea of doing that suddenly felt disrespectful due to how closely I associated it with him. To the point of me just knowing that all those cutaways of Doc in this video would have been played by Mike had he been around to shoot those segments with me because, well, of course he would have. That was just sort of our gimmick.
Hey, Nick.
Yeah.
You're the Doc to my Marty.
Whoa. I don't want to be Doc.
All right, fine, you're Einstein.
No. If anything, okay, no. We gotta hash this shit out now. I'm Doc. Look, you're kind, but I'm not cool. That smart.
Oh boy.
Yeah.
Fine, you're the Marty to my Doc.
I always assumed you would be Doc because you're the
Doc.
science guy. Essentially, I think I kind of got stuck in a maladaptive feedback loop where my nostalgia for watching the movie with him had made it difficult for me to enjoy the movie in the present. And obviously, since I've shown a ton of clips from the movies and its animated series in this video, 7 or so months worth of distance from the series and making this video has more or less served as a therapeutic time and space for me to reevaluate that nostalgia. By refusing to watch or engage with Back to the Future for a while, it sort of felt like I was trying to preserve the fact that my last memories of it are heavily associated with someone that won't be around to watch it with me again. And in a lot of ways, I think that's in line with the, for lack of a better term, problem with nostalgia. Hyperfixating on the past, and by nature a heavily romanticized version of it, feels good in the moment, but as I've repeatedly said throughout this video by now, it's pretty caustic to the person doing it. And there's obviously some good to be found in nostalgia, in much the same way that morphine isn't inherently bad, but much like morphine, it's just a bit too easy to get hooked on.
But he also talked about a deeper bond with the product. Nostalgia. It's delicate, but potent.
In the article Hindsight Isn't Always 2020, The Dark Side of Nostalgia, author Mandy Moon explores a take shared by Professor Van Verplanken's findings on the subject and says, Verplanken cited several studies that have unearthed positive mental effects resulting from nostalgia, such as the easing of existential distress and increasing feelings of social connectedness. However, even those who identified these positive effects recognize that nostalgia is an idealized recollection and has a melancholic effect. Nostalgic emotions, or any other emotions for that matter, should not be suppressed or ignored. They should be monitored and treated with caution rather than glorified, just like the memories of which they're composed. In my case, this means allowing myself to enjoy Back to the Future if I want to, and allow the cards to fall where they lay in regard to how it makes me feel. Because at least allowing myself to feel whatever emotions I feel watching those movies, whether it be sadness, a conflicted sense of joy, or even a weird sense of apathy towards the franchise for the first time in my life, at least means that I'm doing something now as opposed to trying to manifest feelings from the past. Likewise, even though I have a ton of memories of quoting the Angry Video Game Nerd's Back to the Future reviews with Mike, it's better to allow myself to actually feel however I may feel about the game these days, as it has no impact on what's already gone by. If anything, continuing to enjoy Back to the Future, whether that be the game or the movie, even if it's in a different way than how we used to as kids, is a celebration of our friendship and a healthy way to process my grief surrounding his death. In writing this video, I'm reminded of The Smell of Rain on Dust, which is a book that explores the concept of and surrounding grief from a traditional Mesopotamian perspective. It's not the best book by any stretch of the word, but there was a section in it that really stood out to me and basically surmised that the Western world tends to put way too much emphasis on the loss of material or tangible things over the transformative qualities of those same objects. In the case of Back to the Future and my friendship with Mike, I think it's obvious that the statement can be taken to mean that I was putting too much meaning into the literal act of engaging with the franchise with him, as opposed to the emotional component of it and the way that it could help me process my feelings. Again, the book can be a little hit and miss at times for me, but it's basically just asking people experiencing loss to try and actually confront those feelings as opposed to repressing it. And I think that idea is easily applicable to nostalgia too, since in at least a couple of ways, nostalgia can be viewed as a form of grief. By managing to healthily process our past while also acknowledging our present, I feel like we're giving ourselves the best chance we have at growing as individuals. It may sound counterintuitive, but seeing as life is in such constant flux to begin with, and in spite of our nostalgia for life and the things we cherish within it, it may actually be more respectful to our past to allow ourselves to continue to grow and give ourselves more things to be nostalgic about in the future. Because otherwise, we may just remain in a state of nostalgic stasis and grow increasingly cynical about the present due to our obsession with the past.
I remember this one. I put this on a tape for you, didn't I?
Yeah, this is it.
This is the tape?
Yeah, look.
Where'd you find it?
It was in the tape player.
And that's not to say that we should find a way to just blindly love the present either, far from it, because we're just gonna turn into a bunch of somaed out zombies from A Brave New World if we did, but that we should at least try to find something to love in the present more than a lot of us do at the moment. Additionally, we could stand to think about our nostalgia more critically and to try and recall the things from yesteryear that we seem to have conveniently left out while romanticizing that era. For example, even though I love 80s culture to death, in spite of its current oversaturation in pop culture, I think it'd be silly not to acknowledge how outright bad the decade was at points, thanks to stuff like the AIDS epidemic, the Iran-Contra affair, and the rest of Reaganism too while we're at it. And yes, I do realize that may come across as wanting to be a buzzkill whenever people start talking about Ghostbusters, but the idea is to at least be open to critiquing the glorification of another era, not a call to action to be a dick about it.
And then, because you're so busy doing that, you don't watch very carefully what the program that you're watching is really about. So you become hypnotized. So all that's on TV, it just goes directly into your brain, and you stop judging if it's right or not. So you just swallow and swallow.
But I wouldn't say that we should just blindly critique the past either, rather that we should try and take the extra step and actually reflect on it in a hopefully more meaningful way that'll make living in the present easier. Because as undeniably scary as thinking about the future can be, a subject I know I didn't touch on in this video and only decided to leave out at the last minute because, yikes, this video's already twice as long as Back to the Future NES is to begin with, romanticizing the past and neglecting the present only serves to make it scarier. And yeah, it sounds silly to spiral into this from a review of a goofy NES game, but you gotta start from somewhere with these things, and perhaps unfortunately for everyone still watching, this is what the game made me want to talk about. Anyway, to sum things up, Back to the Future for the NES isn't a bad game so much as it's a disappointing one, but I wouldn't necessarily let that keep you from playing it, as it's got some good things going for it. For starters, the simple gameplay loop can actually be fun in small doses, and seeing as the game's only 30 minutes long to begin with, it doesn't ever really outstay its welcome. Plus, if you're a longtime AVGN fan, you may actually be in for a few surprises, or at least a quaint experience worth sharing with your friends should you decide to play this game for the first time. It's honestly pretty cool how many different ways one can approach this game. Whether it's within the context of being a quirky piece of merchandising from the 80s, a game that was famously reviewed by one of YouTube's early trailblazers, or even just on its own merits as being a fun but simple game, there's at least some fun to be had here. And personally, I enjoyed getting to experience the game for myself after going at least a decade or so without playing it. Even though it was kinda hard to engage with Back to the Future stuff when I started making this video, it was cool getting to play through this because of how it made me want to explore my thoughts surrounding why I had shied away from the franchise for a bit. At any rate, I'm personally glad that I gave this game a shot because, as a longtime Back to the Future fan, it's a part of that franchise's history whether we want it to be or not. And while we can pretend that it doesn't exist in favor of some of the series' cooler spin-offs like the Telltale game or the IDW comic run, why exactly should we? Especially when it isn't actively hurting anybody at best, and at worst, mindlessly hate-brigading it only stands to reinforce some of nostalgia's more caustic traits. Anyway, that brings us to the end of this video. Feel free to leave an answer to the question of the day over in the comments if you haven't already, to donate to my Buy Me a Coffee or subscribe to my Patreon for some bonus goodies and all that good stuff, the links are in the description, and to follow me on social media by looking up @NichePlays on Twitter or Instagram, or by, again, following the links in the description. On top of that, if you aren't sick of my voice yet for whatever reason, you could check out my retro movie and TV podcast, Media Obscura. It's hosted by myself, along with my girlfriend Sierra and my best friend Raekwon. We talk about old movies and TV shows for usually an hour or two every 3 or 4 weeks, and it's a podcast. Take that information and do with it what you will. You can check it out on your favorite podcast player, man, I don't know. So yeah. Bye.